I welcome the opportunity to look at the department's estimates and spending, particularly at this time, as it seems like it was probably the overriding concern when it comes to denying redress for so many thousands of survivors of mother and baby institutions. There was obviously the department's own report that found that survivors themselves wanted redress to be based on, the main finding was forced family separation, and time spent in institution was much lower down, but we also had UN human rights officials saying the same. Thousands of ordinary people emailing all of the public representatives here, and also this committee has continuously repeated the fact that we thought that redress should be based on other things, including forced family separation, but that ultimately nobody should be excluded. So my first question, Minister, is if you could provide the estimates for how much it would have cost to include those groups in the scheme.
Deputy, my understanding is, and this is from the interdepartmental group report that came forward in mid-2021, my recollection is that in order to make provision for payments at a similar rate for those under 6 months to people who had been in institutions for under 6 months as a child, that would have been an additional €300 million. So that would have brought an overall cost of €1.1 billion to the scheme. If an enhanced medical card had been provided to everybody under 6 months, as well as those over 6 months, I think the overall cost goes to €1.6 billion.
Thank you. And the department's briefing says that it's only and you kind of mentioned it, I think, in your opening statement, perhaps I just didn't understand it fully, that it's only the set-up costs of the payment scheme are accounted for in this estimate. So I'm wondering, why have only the set-up costs for the scheme been provided for in the estimate for the vote, the 10 million? How would the rest be?
So, as you know, Deputy, the legislation to base the institutional payment scheme is working its way through the Dáil at the moment, and obviously has to go through the Seanad subsequently. In our engagement with DEPA in terms of working on budget 2023, they indicated that in terms of the costings that they would propose in budget 2023, it would be the costings for the establishment of the payment scheme. So work is already underway in terms of the establishment, whether it's the additional recruitment in the department, whether it's the training that will be necessary to put in place those mechanisms to run, which as we know will be one of the largest schemes in the state's history. As soon as both the legislation is passed and the administrative structures are put in place, the scheme will then be ready to operate. And at that point, we'll return to DEPA and seek the financial support to allow for the drawing down of those initial applications in terms of a supplementary estimate. So we imagine that sometime later on this year, once the legislation is passed, we will need a supplementary estimate to support the costs of the initial I suppose it'll be 8-9 months of the year in terms of the initial costs of the scheme.
Okay, so it's not the way that because it's not in this list of estimates, whatever, that it won't happen until 2024 or something. There will be payments in 2023. There will.
We're, as I say, we're working as quickly as possible to pass the legislation and undertake the administrative work to support the scheme. Obviously, the legislation needs to be passed to support the scheme, but you know we're working to get that done.
And the payments can come in 2023 as well.
Yes, they can. Yeah.
Thank you. And then. And perhaps excuse my ignorance on it, but the 10 million then for the setup costs, like, how does it cost 10 million? I know it's the biggest scheme and all of that stuff, but I'm just curious to know what that money goes into and how it'll be set up, and just, I suppose, to reassure people as well that it will happen quickly and that it will be an efficient system. I just wonder if you could explain a bit about that.
Part of it is in terms of the additional staff that will be necessary within the department to oversee the scheme. Part of it will be in terms of, I suppose, IT supports in terms of creating an IT infrastructure that will support the application process. Part of it will be the information campaign that we'll undertake to make people aware of their rights. As you know, we undertook a very significant information campaign in terms of the Birth Information and Tracing Act, and we will be, and it's something I know that's come up in discussions, we'll be undertaking campaign on an international basis, as we did with the Birth Information Tracing Act, to make people aware outside of the country. There will be a substantial number of people who have left the country who will be entitled to make an application under the scheme. So those would be a number of the things that 10 million will support, and that's, I suppose, work that is underway beginning now, or is underway now, and hence that's why the money needed to be in the budget line at the start of the year.
Okay, I'll come back to the birth information tracing in one moment. Just one more question on that is, I'm wondering, is there an update on the church making a contribution? I know you had requested that they might contribute to the redress scheme. Is there any update on that?
I say we continue to engage with the religious institutions. As you know, I've met with the religious institutions and made, I suppose, the point that I think it's important that they make a substantial contribution to the overall scheme. Those engagements are ongoing. I always was very clear that I didn't want the setup of this scheme to be contingent or dependent on the conclusion of those negotiations. I think the scheme needs to be set up and operated, and those engagements with the congregations can continue at the same time.
Do you think that, is there any way that, obviously, and I think that's good, it had to go ahead regardless of what the church would contribute to these estimates or whatever, but if they, I mean, I don't think it should be a case of if they're willing or not. I think they should be compelled to, but if they do pay towards compensation, given that you've allowed for this amount of compensation to go without any contribution from any religious order, could it then be extended potentially to people who spent less than 6 months in an institution? As there'd be extra money then?
Deputy, I'm working in terms of passing legislation based on a specific government decision. Obviously, legislation can be changed subsequently. Schemes can be changed subsequently if a subsequent decision is taken, but I don't want to kind of speculate in terms of where we are with the process right now.
There would be potential, I suppose, then. And then just, you mentioned the birth information tracing there. I'm just wondering, people applying for their information are, I think, being presented with unacceptable delays. The Adoption Authority of Ireland and TUSA are going with that maximum allowable time, which was supposed to be kind of the exceptional circumstance amount of time for somebody to receive that information. And in your, that seems to be the default, but in your estimates there's no kind of increase in TUSA staff for the extra workload in providing information to adoptees. And when you just outlined there the 10 million sort of being allocated to allow for the extra workload when there's a redress scheme and all the applications and the IT and all of the things that come with that. I'm just wondering if you can explain why there hasn't been an extra allocation in relation to the birth information and tracing legislation. And also in the subhead for the Adoption Authority of Ireland, it shows a decrease in the estimate for 2023 compared to 2022. So I'm just wondering, how would the Adoption Authority of Ireland be expected to comply with its new obligations under the birth information and tracing legislation with an actual decrease in funding?
Both the Adoption Authority of Ireland and TUSLA have been provided with additional resources, additional financial resources in terms of the ability both to increase their levels of staff and also increase their systems, particularly on the IT side, in order for them to be able to undertake their work under the birth information and tracing legislation, and they are provided for under those specific heads. They're not coming from the other two mother and baby institution heads that we've discussed already. I recognise there are delays in terms of the provision of information. As of, I think, last week, 6,700 people had applied for their information to either the AAI or TUSLA, and of those, 1,700 have received a conclusive answer in terms of their application. So both organisations are making their way through the backlog. There is a backlog, and that is really frustrating for former residents and adopted people. I understand that, but the information is being provided to people. People are being linked to relatives through the tracing scheme that has been set up and through the contact preference register, and the overall, I suppose, outcome of this legislation, which is the provision of information for some people who've never actually gotten that information before, that is being delivered.
And is there any scope at this late stage to give an extra allocation? Like I said, there's a reduction in the Adoption Authority of Ireland's funding. I'm just wondering, obviously you'd expect, like I said with the redress scheme, that you might see an increase based on the extra workload. So I'm just wondering, is there any kind of scope maybe to revisit that and to ensure that the delays just stop now? Because like you gave the numbers there, and it's great that however many, the 1,700 people have gotten it, but there's the thousands of people that are actually still waiting, and there's something perhaps could be done at this point to reduce that list.
Yes. Just in terms of the pay allocation, which is the key element, I suppose, in terms of AAI, AAI's pay has gone up by, I think, 1.1 million between 2022 and 2023. There was a small decrease, as you've referred to, in terms of its overall allocation. The main reason for that was that the big information campaign that was AAI driven, that took place last year, isn't being repeated this year. There will be some continued information campaign, but I suppose the scale, and you know yourself, Deputy, everyone getting the leaflet in on the buses, on the trains, a campaign of that scale isn't being repeated by AAI this year. But in terms of the people to actually undertake the work, the pay part of AAI's allocation has increased by 1.1 million between 22 and 23.
Okay, I suppose just the last point, and I just ask maybe if you could consider keeping the previous allocation of funding and putting it into trying to get the information out to people quicker, rather than, I don't mean put it back into an information campaign, but just as if it, I think it would be amazing if that could be done, basically. And then on to just, and it's my last point here, do I have enough time to ask another? It's, on domestic violence, Minister, Safe Ireland's pre-budget submission showed that the state's only providing 29% of the required refuge spaces, and this is something I know we've talked about before. The Istanbul Convention standard is 1 space per 10,000 people, and Ireland provides obviously a fraction of that, with the government and department relying on that kind of technicality, 1 space per 10,000 women rather than people. And not only are we funding less than 1/3 of spaces, but it seems that we're actually funding even less than that, according to the figures of the estimate. So in 2021, you funded 22 emergency domestic violence refuges, but that's decreased to 21 for 2022 and this year. And concerning family refuge spaces, you funded 155 in 2021, but that's actually decreased to 152 this year. So that situation seems completely unjustifiable when the whole aim was to increase domestic violence refuge spaces. I don't understand how we're now funding less than since that campaign has really kind of taken off. And if there was actually going to be an attempt to provide the recommended bare minimum, we'd need a serious increase in an allocation of funding there to really drive that on.
Can I just returning to if I can briefly just conclude on the point on information and tracing, the birth information tracing legislation, just to say in terms of, I have a quarterly meeting with TUSLA, and that has I've stressed to the outgoing chief exec and to the interim chief exec in terms of the importance that I place on TUSLA fulfilling the obligations it has to rapidly meet people's requests for information, and the importance of the organisation doing all it can. So just to say, both in terms of the financial resources that have been provided, but we have also directly raised the issue with the organisations in terms of the work that they're doing. In terms of domestic violence, and I'm not trying to make an excuse here, Deputy, but this funding stream has been taken away from my department and is now with the Department of Justice. They are now responsible for that funding that TUSLA gets for DSGBV. This department is responsible for, by and large, all the rest, other than the education and support service, but I don't have a direct line of sight on that. I know Minister McEntee did secure a very significant increase for DSGB funding. I think she secured a 9 million funding on the capital side of things. I know Minister McEntee obviously has brought forward the 3rd National Strategy, and as part of that, there is work ongoing to identify refuge spaces, and deputies have already referenced a priority area. But I'll just be honest, I'm probably not going to be able to speak to the detail of the number of
My
refugees
apologies,
this
yes,
year
the wrong-
versus last
wrong
year.
department to ask them. Yeah. Thanks, Chair.